Thank you. Thanks for coming. It's an honor to be here. At one of the most delightful places to read poetry in the United States. And by way of introduction, I thought I'd read a poem. Actually, it was Michael's suggestion that I read this poem. It's called Head to Toe. Left foot, 3 bones snapped, age 10, sliding into home plate. Scored, but if you cannonball a kid off home plate, you must consider the consequences. Abdomen, left side, a starfish scar from an arrow shot in his belly, age 12. That evening, his dad got home, heard the news, and barreled off into the neighbor's house, whacking the kid and his father with the broken shaft. Agog, woozy with the tetanus shot, he watches the beatings, learning more about consequences. Or was it love? Or justice? Head, concussion, age 14. His buddies tossed him in the public pool, but his head didn't clear the apron. A simple lesson in gravity and misplaced trust. Right leg, age 16. Shin bone gouged from the kick pedal of the little Harley he rode to school until crashing. But he is growing up, keeping mum about his near beheading from the clothesline wire. He says he gave his bike to a friend, pleasing his mom. Left shoulder, 23, a red scar from a sliver of shrapnel spun from a cloud of razor bombs exploding over Tet Offensive 1968. Wounded and missing, they telegrammed his kin, but he knew where he was all the time, sort of. Head, concussion, age 30. Wife cracked a skillet on his head, but even he thought he deserved it. No further comment. But the girl's name was not Betty, Elizabeth. Spine. His x-rays at middle age show an ominous shadow, but it's just arthritis from jammed up ribs, thrown off a horse in Las Truchas, New Mexico, too drunk to hang on. Left shoulder, 3 rips on the rotator cuff, from bucking a chainsaw for 2 straight weeks, cutting oaks and banyans off their Miami house. In the hurricane debris and the blistering heat, broken snakes and iguanas, dead tree frogs, woodpecker hatchlings, saw teeth screaming. Head, concussion, age 50, New Mexico, another horse. What did they smell? Booze, bravura? Left hand, broken little finger reattached with a pin. The boxer's break, the surgeon said, claims a board fell back and split his fingers. Front tooth chipped. Chomped down in so much rage as he swung at the guy, he broke his own tooth. Still a bit slow regarding this consequence thing.
I wanted to start by asking, because it's not clear to me, reading Remembering Heaven's Face, when you went to Vietnam, did you know that you were a poet already? Had you started as a poet? I know you were studying literature.
No, I went, you have to remember how old I was.
How old were you?
I went to Vietnam at 21, 22, so I still had enough of an adolescent sense of romanticism about being a poet. And I had this verification that I was one because some of my poems had already appeared when I was an undergraduate. And the teacher we shared, John Barth, he was impressed by that. He sort of said, scratching his head, he said, I don't think I've had any student publish anything yet. He said, you might be the first. And of course, there were many distinguished writers coming out of his classes. But yeah, I was still an undergraduate at Penn State. And I went to Harvard because Robert Lowell was there. And I had my sense of myself as a poet who would bring, I guess what you're calling scholarly, but for me a very living, vital thing in the classical world into my sense of writing. And Lowell, with his sense of history, seemed to capture that for me. So I was delighted to have that opportunity. So I resented going to Vietnam, resented the kind of moral obligation that event that you talked about. Robert McNamara is coming to Harvard and getting trapped in that alley and making essentially a crowd-baiting and arrogant speech. That made it pretty hard for me to just sit in Widener Library reading Old English, which is what I was doing at the time. And I missed it. And when I went, I thought that was the end of poetry for me. So it was with a sense of a naive sense of sacrifice that I went to Vietnam, because I thought I was giving up the thing that meant most to me, and that was writing poetry. Because it struck me as the idea of going to Vietnam and think you'd be writing poetry where people were dying struck me as vampiristic. I didn't think that. I thought that was over. What I didn't know was what I've learned later, that as Dante says in De Vulgari Eloquentia, the proper subjects of poetry are love, virtue, and war. And the war part, I have no idea what Dante meant by that, but I know what it meant for me, is that in fact love and virtue display themselves extraordinarily in warfare, in the misery when the dogs of war are unleashed, that people do horrible things to each other routinely, but that every now and then something extraordinary happens that is where the poles of humanity are being defined for you in dramatic ways every day.